I'm just seeing it move faster. In my own world, if I look back at the last 5 years in the companies I've worked for, and just the things we were talking about, how quickly they were moving, uh, it's hard to keep pace. And having an adaptable mindset, I think, is very key for long-term success.
This episode is brought to you by Green Skies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction through an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Green Skies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Green Skies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell, and today on the show, we have Mike Pellet. He is the Director of Internal Audit at Lyft. Formerly did a director positions all over, and customer service roles and marketing roles. And so I thought that was super interesting. So we definitely hit on that and how that experience has shaped him as an internal audit leader. To learn from like a marketing expert and how they can apply that to internal audit, I think was fascinating. We also talk about how to staff a good team, and Mike has a pretty innovative approach to doing that. So I'd highly recommend checking that part out. And then one of the reasons I reached out to Mike, he had posted, or on Internal Audit 360, they had posted an article that he had written about why all auditors need to be data experts. And so we talk about that article and his position on being a data expert, and then asking the question, do you feel like it's going to soon be, why do all auditors need to be AI experts? And so we share some thoughts there, get Mike's as well. All right, here we go. So what is in either your internet browsing history or your ChatGPT or Llama, Claude, any LLM that you might be using? What's been going on inside of work, maybe outside of work as well? What's going on?
So probably three things that are currently in my chat history, two personal. One, the Premier League. I'm a fan of Arsenal football team. And crazy things are happening with Manchester City and Arsenal losing. So that's a huge concern to me. So I've been spending a lot of time reading about that. Second thing, also personal, EICMA is going on, which is, or I think it just ended, is a motorcycle show in Italy. It's kind of the big one in Europe. So a lot of new models are being introduced. So that's really exciting. On the work side, a lot of it has to do with what people think the regulatory environment's going to look like here in the United States in the next 2 months.
Yeah.
With the new administration, very different perspectives, trying to get ahead of how do we think about risk and what that regulatory environment looks like.
All right, I'm glad you mentioned that. I have this tab open. So I saw this article earlier and just went, yep, I need to read that later. And so I have it open, but it's from Richard Chambers' blog. What could the second Trump era mean for audit risk and compliance team? So I have not read that, but that's probably a pretty good place to start.
I will check it out. It is a good place to start.
We were talking movies and books before we hit the record button. What's an underrated movie that you could recommend and people go, oh yeah, that looked awful, but now I'm going to check it out?
So I wouldn't say it looked awful, but because it was actually very well regarded. I'm actually going to cheat here and give you a short mini series. And it's old, but I recently watched it with my son about a month ago, and it's Band of Brothers. Highly regarded at the time, but not everybody watched it because it's very World War II war themed. But I have to say it's a master class in management and leadership. And so for me, I think most people wouldn't think about it from that perspective. And that's often why I recommend it to people. I also read the book, highly, highly recommend that. But my personal experience is watching it can teach you so much about interpersonal dynamics and leadership. And I would highly recommend it. And a lot of people, younger people coming up may not have seen it because I think it came out in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I think I was maybe a junior or sophomore in high school, and I remember Ross from Friends is one of the like platoon leaders or something like
Yes.
that, and just the preview of him being a serious like army dude and trying to yell at people, I was like, "You're Ross, man!" Like
Yeah.
it didn't. So I didn't watch that until I think it was either last year or 2 years ago.
Oh, really?
I finally went, okay, let's do it. I think it's one of those internet jokes of like, maybe it's as you become a dad, or maybe it's a late 40s thing. I forget, early 40s maybe, but it was you basically don't have a choice. You have to get into World War II history. Like that's just
Yes.
part of
It's part of the rules of being a dad.
it's part of middle age. And so maybe I just went, all right, let me
Absolutely.
jump back into this. Let me just
Yeah.
that is very,
It's
very
great.
good.
It is
Yeah, it
great,
was.
and I will say Ross does a fantastic job as Captain Sobel,
Yeah.
and really teaches you a lot about bad leadership.
Mhm.
And it's really fascinating to see at the very end when they talk about him and how they made it through all of this in part thanks to him, yet he was a terrible leader. And it's really interesting to think about from a management standpoint.
Yeah, he ended up being a guy you can hate pretty easily
Yes,
in there.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Well, all right. On to the topics at hand. What's going on? Because hiring is still an issue for people. Hiring and retention is still a struggle for a lot of people, especially now there's back to office mandates that are seemingly every day. There's some new, large company that's going, nope, everybody's back, which obviously isn't going to make it any easier. But relative to that, how are you staffing, or what advice maybe would you give on staffing a good team? So CAEs that are listening out there, or directors, or whoever, um, who need to build their teams out, what kind of advice would you give them?
That it's a great topic, and I the first, I guess, the caveat to my remarks is that each situation is different. Each situation is going to be unique, and so understanding that there's no one size fits all. And as I have watched internal audit over the years that I've been involved in internal audit, I'm seeing, let's call it, an accelerated change just in the last decade or so of how we need to think about these things. So, as we think about demographically what's happening in society, right? The number of kids has been going down. So the less kids going to college, less kids, just available, period. The number of CPAs is going down. How traditionally audit was thought of is that you need to be a CPA in order to be a good auditor. The number of young people going into internal audit working for the big four, the large agencies, all going down. So you don't have this sort of rich pool of potential applicants. I can say that my ideas on this have evolved over the last 5 years or so. And as you think about it, what are some of those things that you can do as a team to really meet the needs and the demands that you have today? And the way I always think, I come from software originally, not a classically trained auditor, spent most of my time in software, building systems, managing software development operations. And I think about it in terms of what are my requirements. And so as I've thought about it more recently, when you're working particularly with small teams, is you're not going to have the diversity of experience that you might get from a much larger group of people and a larger team. So the way I've approached the problem is really maybe the right role here is to bring people in who have broad business experience and business knowledge, and allow them to run a program where you can outsource potential arms and legs on specific activities, whether you need a subject matter expertise, whether you need just specific audit testing. Obviously, you always want to be driving towards, and this is the nice thing about generative AI and large language models, you can start driving towards what are those things that we can automate that potentially we don't necessarily need to have somebody do physically. There is also just being good about data analytics is going to help you and drive many efficiencies. But the model that I've really settled on is this idea of you have sort of a program manager type, the person that kind of comes to the table with a broad-based experience, business knowledge, doesn't necessarily have to be classically trained in audit for lots of years. You can teach audit skills to people because I do believe a lot of the skills are very universal. And your staffing model looks more like you bring people in as you need them. So you have specialists. I tend to like to, as per my movie reference, tend to like to think a little bit sometimes in terms of the military. But think of it like as a special forces team. And outside of the fun action movies that we see with special forces, the reality of most special forces is there's a lot of specialists who have specific skill sets. One might be politics, the other might be interpersonal communication, one might be policing. And those people in the military come together whenever they're in a theater of operations, and they can add those values to whatever the situation is that they're dealing with. Maybe they're helping set up a system of government. Maybe they're helping small groups of people to do things like farming, which a lot of people don't think of in terms of what needs to be done. And I think that model very much applies to internal audit, because what I have just noticed, I've been working for many years, but what I've noticed very recently in the last 10 years or so, just that pace of change is driving so quickly now. And it's very difficult for you to keep pace and to necessarily have a staffing model today that is going to be really effective for you just a year from now, or even a year and a half from now. So the way I like to think about it is a bit of an outsourcing model.
Just the pace of change, this is something I've been thinking about lately, is because in the past 4 years, between obviously 2020 changed everything. I mean, everybody's world basically changed. And then from that, there was a bigger push to get analytics because, hey, we want our risks to be known ahead of time, or we want to be able to predict those, or we want to have monitoring around those, so that we can be better prepared for something like this potentially down the future, or just risks in general, or as Richard refers to it, the perma crisis that we have kind of been going through over the years. And then there was it seemed like I'd never heard of agile auditing. And then all of a sudden in 2020, it was just like everywhere. And so then that's a lot of change for a lot of people, especially if you don't have someone that was there with the experience to kind of walk you through it, and you try to take that on yourself. That can be, if you don't kind of carve it out right, maybe. That can be a ton of change. Obviously, the past almost 2 years now, or 2-year anniversary is coming up, of ChatGPT and AI, and how much that is going to change. Like, there's been massive amounts of changes in the past 4 years. So I almost feel like we're used to it. It's just like, oh, here's another massive change. And then obviously with maybe the next 4 years, what could be changes there. Like, I feel like we're almost naturally getting built into change. What do you think about that?
I agree with that 100%. And I think, it's sort of the Moore's Law concept, and I'm just seeing it move faster. In my own world, if I look back at the last 5 years in the companies I've worked for, and just the things we were talking about, how quickly they were moving, uh, it's hard to keep pace. And having an adaptable mindset, I think, is very key for long-term success. And understanding that the original, like when you think about chess, people was like, oh, well, it's kind of like playing chess, like, right? You have to think about where the pieces are moving. But I would argue it's you're sitting down to play chess, and suddenly you're playing backgammon, or suddenly you're playing checkers, or you have to get up and go out and play tennis, and it's a very different perspective. And I think it can be very unsettling. And to me, from a recruiting strategy and staffing, to tie back into your earlier question, the idea that I think is really the right idea is to find people that are adaptable, that are flexible, that understand the pace of how things need to happen. And you can adjust. If your audit plan ceases to be effective 6 months in because the dynamics of your company has changed, maybe they spin off a whole operation that you had planned to spend a fair amount of time there, you need a team that can adapt to that. And having a flexible staffing model, I think, is key to that.
Yeah, and so that's another big change I didn't mention, but the annual audit plan started to kind of die because of 2020, and people go, you can't plan out your year because things change so fast. So quarterly is what is typically kind of recommended now, and what folks tend to be doing more. You have a year-long plan to a degree because that's, people still want to see that, but then you go, look, we're basically just going to change this thing every quarter. So, but I think that's another really good example of that's a pretty decent sized change for a lot of people.
100%, and particularly in audit, because like audit has been sort of stuck in, this is the right way to do this. And so you build your audit plan, you start an audit by pre-planning, you build your risk and control matrix, you identify those key risks related to audit, then you go out and interview people and you start to gather, key artifacts related to whatever the audit focus is. And what's really fantastic, and I say this in a very positive way, although some people might not feel this way, is you could be midway through that and everything that you thought was going to happen has just changed 100%, or 180 degrees. And I think you just have to be adaptable. You have to start to educate yourself in a way that says, you know what, no matter what comes at me, I'm going to learn how to deal with it and to rethink whatever I may have thought that I knew just 2 months ago and where I need to go moving forward. And I think that adaptability is a key skill for future auditors. I think as we think about the future of audit, and we talked a little bit about this just a few minutes ago, but this idea of you're just not having the young people come up, but you have this rich pool, I think, of leaders, managers and above that audit shops can really leverage through either rotation programs or joint audits, some more collaboration type activities that can really enrich your audit program and also give value back to the business, which I think is one of the core things.
That staffing model that you mentioned, could you give an example of where you've done that, where you went like, hey, yeah, let's go bring in this business person, they'll kind of PM it, and then we'll have, I like the way you put it, the arms and the legs on the, or maybe feet on the ground, or however, you want to say it, but an example of where you guys have done that?
100%. I'll use vague generalities just to, for obvious reasons, but so bringing in our employee is essentially the program or senior project manager on the effort. We, in certain cases, may bring in a subject matter expert. So it's a complicated issue. Let's say a technological related issue that is very complex. You need somebody with a lot of deep experience. You bring that person in to advise as a consultant on the audit. And then maybe you bring a team to do your core testing, to do some data analysis, to do maybe interviews or follow-ups, to, depending on the nature of the audit, sort of do this specific thing. So we actually use that in my current job. We use that quite a bit, actually, that model. And it's proven very effective for us because the business actually gets value out of bringing in a subject matter expert from the outside who can provide some context, who can provide some experience and some knowledge. And we found that to be incredibly useful. The business partner usually gets a lot of value out of it as well. And then we can actually use, in some cases, a completely different firm to come in and actually staff, just the testing components of it, if there are reviews. And again, depending on the complexity of the audit, it does give you freedom and flexibility. And then how we think about budgeting and planning is built around that idea.
So I do want to give you a chance to explain that, why you feel like all auditors need to be data experts. But then I think the next question after that I was thinking was, okay, well, what about AI? Do you feel like everyone should be AI experts, and what your thoughts around that are? So kind of the difference between the two, and maybe where you're seeing your folks spend more time, or maybe even yourself maybe spend more time. But so to bring that roundabout way of asking, why do all auditors need to be data experts in your opinion? And do you feel like there's starting to be a shift to all auditors need to be AI experts?
So let me parse the question apart a little bit. So first, I'll give you a direct answer on the AI experts. Today, I'm going to say no. And when I'm going to interpret your question as AI, as generative AI, large language models type AI,
Yep.
not sort of the effort to build robotics or systems that are completely autonomous.
Right.
I would say a flat out no on AI, and I'll tell you why I think that. Like there are two elements to generative AI that we are currently dealing with in the modern business environment. One is the sort of open sourced ChatGPT that has used the internet for better or for worse to gather every piece of information it can, kind of pour through that and provide you with either answers or content that you may desire. What that has a lot of great uses, particularly in the areas of improving writing skills, visualizations, video. Some of the video things I've seen are just fantastic.
Crazy.
Obviously, still images. Periodically we all get hit up on LinkedIn like, hey, improve your headshot. Just send us the worst photo of you and we'll make you look like a superstar. So there's that generative AI that I think is useful, but it's a very specific tool, I think, and in particular areas. Then I would look at the generative AI that lays over top of your existing data streams and your existing systems within your organization. And that one is, and I'm going to oversimplify this, but it's very much a heavily boosted tool that is helping you understand the data you already have. So at the risk of oversimplifying this, and I'm sure many AI experts and generative AI experts will come back and complain with my characterization of this, but it is essentially a data sort of modeling tool, if you will, that sits in with your own data. Now, as with any tool like that is middleware, that's what we used to call it back in the day when I was working on systems. The adage garbage in, garbage out still applies. If your underlying data systems are not giving the information or potentially could contain information that is not correct or erroneous or potentially misleading, then whatever that great tool is on the front end that is pulling it out is going to essentially be repeating information that's bad. And I think we've seen some examples of that, right? Like we've seen some examples on the internet side of just they crawled everything. So you have, horrific images that people were just completely culturally insensitive or et cetera. You've had language that the hallucination factor of things that are wrong, most likely informed from data that it picked up from other sources, whether it's hate content or whatever. And so I think I would argue, no, the internal auditor doesn't need to be an expert on generative AI so much, because that's a very specific software tool. It's a software, tool that lays over existing data systems. I think what the auditor really needs to focus on is, how does that data run on the back end? And to bolster that point of view, I just recently saw Gartner actually came out and was they did it at a conference, but they were just basically talking about really the biggest challenge right now for generative AI within companies using existing company data is problems with data governance, problems with data systems, being poorly managed, problems with, data integrity. And I think that came out just in the last week, like Gartner was doing a conference on this. And I think that's spot on. And if internal auditors who are rushing to, the gap, because everybody's putting a lot of pressure across all areas of the business, we need to be in generative AI. We need to be doing more. We need to, be more efficient. If we can get rid of positions so that people can do more activities, so we can do more with less people, then that pressure has created this false sense of security around what this is actually doing. And I think auditors have the responsibility. We're always the ones that are slowly walking into the fire to understand all the things that need to happen. And I think for an auditor, it's really important for us to understand the back-end data. So let me go into a little bit of that is, how do your systems function? Do you have good data governance? Are your systems talking to each other? And I can tell you, I've worked for very, very small companies. I've started my own company. I've worked for very, very large companies. And the one universal truth of that is nobody has a fantastic data system. It just does. I haven't seen it. I'm sure maybe somebody does, but I just have never seen it. And so there's always problems. There's always problems with data accuracy. There's always problems with, is this the right data or is that the right data? Oh, well, we have a sales system that doesn't actually talk to our invoicing system. So we manually enter invoices and the salespeople are manually doing their things, and half the time they don't reconcile. understanding those data elements and then how to get through to those data sources and understand if those data sources are actually accurately telling us what they need to tell us is critically important for the auditor, in my opinion, particularly because everything is data driven now. Like I have not sat in a meeting with a leader in the last 5 to 10 years where the leader hasn't said, well, what are the KPIs? What are the metrics? What are the data points that is telling us what you're saying? Show me the data. And so that's why I feel very strongly that auditors need to be data experts. It's just incumbent upon our role, because I do see a future where auditors are spending about 60 to 80% of their time just working with data. And you're seeing that. I love you were talking to Richard just a few weeks ago about connected risk, and key to good connected risk, which is something I've been working on over the last few years, is having really great data points, is having those key pieces of data that tell you something about the risks that you're facing. And it goes a layer, it can get really deep and it can get really messy. And prior to joining audit, I was in the customer experience space, and it's very similar, because in a customer experience environment, the best of breed customer experience teams are pulling all types of data and they're looking at everything. And they're not necessarily saying, oh, we have one metric that's going to tell us everything we need to know. They may have 20 or 30 metrics. And the auditor's responsible for looking back and saying, oh, was that piece of data actually a good piece of data for us to focus on? Or do we need to be expanding the types of data that we're looking at? Or do we just need to do cleanup in our data, kind of our data repositories to make sure that we have those things? So to me, I think that's the argument that I would make. And honestly, one of the big fears that I have about the AI boom right now is we're spending a lot of time on the front end, which is, what are the prompts we want to use for the AI? What do we put into GPT? But I can still see, I just, even when I do Google searches, you still see the AI generated content. And I would say 25, 30% of the time I look at it and I'm like, that's wrong. That's a wrong piece of information. And so we shouldn't be relying on that. And I think the auditor has the obligation to ask the hard question of, hey, how do you know that piece of data that we're using this large language model AI tool for is accurate?
And I think to bring the customer success example into that is one I heard recently. I thought it was pretty good, but let's say you have like your LLM, it's hooked into everything in your environment, right? Got access to everything. And you go, give me the top 50 customers based on revenue, whatever. And it goes, boop, 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 spits it out. And then you go, all right, now tell me customer complaints that we've gotten from those customers in the past 9 months. If it doesn't get something, if it gets something wrong in either one of those questions, you have a problem. So that's a type of, even if it's a hallucination, so maybe it's not even a data governance issue, maybe it's a hallucination issue, that can be a problem. And so then to your point, like the customer success people, they're pulling data from everywhere. And so it needs to be good everywhere. My hope is, and we've had a data governance expert on here in the past, probably need to reach out to her and see how business is going. But my hope is that because data governance has been around for a long time, some pretty strong people pushing for it, making the case. But, if you're the person that's writing off on the check and you go, data governance, like, I don't really want to spend money on that when we could do this other thing, or, help the sales team or whatever that is. But I'm hoping now that it has shined a brighter, wider, maybe light on the importance of data governance, to where people are going, hey, all this AI stuff you want to do, board, executives, whoever, we can't really do it until we get this piece figured out or done better. And they go, okay, fine, let's do the let's do the data governance thing or something to that effect. But I'm hoping it shines a light on that a little bit more.
I agree with your perspective 100%. And I would add to that, look, we have the responsibility as auditors to validate what we do. And we can't just walk into a room and say, well, I kind of think we're doing this wrong. So, that's a problem.
Yeah. Our data is through our testing. Yeah,
exactly. And so I think data works. We have to think about data, and we have to think about these large language models and AI tools the same way. Is we should be the skeptical ones of everything that comes out of ChatGPT, of everything that comes out of an internal AI tool, and ask the hard questions, because it's easy to rely on it. But you've seen the high-profile cases of a lawyer asking ChatGPT in the early days to write my legal brief and submitting a brief on cases that didn't even exist. But it's possible, and take hallucination out of the picture, because hallucination, I'm not sure technically what's going on with hallucination. That's smarter people than me work on that. But there are systems where you might have errant pieces of data that are not the single source of truth, and that could be being pulled into that conversation. So to your point, give me your top 50 customers. If businesses are making decisions on the top 50 customers, they might actually not be the top 50 customers. And it might not be a function of bad, a large language model or generative AI prompts. It might be a function more of, hey, it pulled a data source that nobody expected, that we had data that maybe hadn't been cleaned up or hadn't been archived or had been erroneously entered. Like somebody uploaded something and we never fixed it.
Yeah. And to hit on just the complexities of all this, even with something as simple as a customer, if you ask accounting, what's a customer? They would say they're a customer once we get paid. Then they're a customer. If you ask sales, they go, they're a customer once they sign. But there's a huge, that could be months before the sign and the pay happens. So what customer, if we ask for 50 customers, what customer are we asking for? And again, that's a data governance issue. So even just something as common as who are your customers, depending on who you ask in the organization, that answer is going to be completely different.
Yeah, and I think it's a fantastic point. And I think if I had a message to auditors about this topic, I would say, does your organization understand how to define terms? And is everybody on the same page about the terms? Because I'll give you an example. In a past life, when I was working before I came into the audit space, leaders would interchange metrics and measurements. And I started to dig around, and I would sit in meetings, and at the end of meetings, somebody would throw out the word. So I'm going to use this as an example, like, oh, well, we need to have the right metrics. And okay, great. What do you mean by metrics? And what do you mean by a measurement? And what I started to learn was that there were widely differing views about what that meant. And I took it upon myself to really define that. So when I sat down with people and said, hey, if you're going to use the term metrics, here's how I define that. Now, if you have a better definition, let me know. 9 times out of 10, people don't. And to me, I've seen it in small companies. I've seen it in very large companies, and I've consulted to companies for many, many years as well. And I just see it all over the place. That's like a starting point issue is, what do you mean by a metric? What do you mean by a measurement? And to me, like, I came up with the definition of a metric is something that you measure performance on, that you can actually measure performance. Like it's like the rule or a data element. I can say that, hey, if we reach this particular number, then I can pay bonuses. I can, promote somebody, whatever. Where measurements, I always define it as that's something that tells you something about what's going on. It may not be necessarily something you can control. So I often describe measurement as like temperature. If it's 79 degrees, here in most of the United States, it's a generally nice day. But if it's 79 degrees in Antarctica, we might be looking at a catastrophic, global weather event. And so that measurement isn't something we can try and achieve, if that's sort of how I try to get people to think about it.
Yeah.
And just parsing that definition opens up a lot of eyes as an auditor for your leaders, because people don't think of it that way. And then you can start having the conversation of, well, what are the unintended consequences of metrics, right? Like if you're holding a great one that's very popular, salespeople to a pipeline metric, where they may be incentivized to have a certain amount in their pipeline, or potentially to not report sales or potential sales in their pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
This is something a lot of auditors I found don't necessarily think about is, if they have the incentive, if somebody's created a metric that says, hey, if you have, 100 items in your pipeline, we're going to hold you to those 100 items on a close ratio. And so what I've seen as the unintended consequence of that is salespeople will then say, oh, well, I'm only going to report 50% of my pipeline because at the end I can close like 90% of my deals, and then I look like a superhero. But what that does is it creates a blind spot for the company because they don't know what the pipeline really looks like, and then forecasting becomes a challenge. And I think internal auditors need to be asking those questions, and that's why data expertise is so critical, because they need to not only ask the questions but understand how the company tracks that, to be able to parse through it and say, okay, which system tracks this particular piece of information? How does that information get entered? Is it manual? Is it automated? How does that work?
I think that a bit of an aside, but because you hit on it, and I know especially it's more on the fraud front, which we definitely hang around in. But we had to do a like some kind of sales audit or something like that. I forget what the nature of it was, but I know it was around sales. And so I have a friend. He runs a sales training platform, and he's got a Slack channel, and it's all salespeople, and they talk in there. You can ask whatever. And I said, hey man, can you let me get a login for that real quick? I got to ask a question. And so I just said, how would you find fraud? You guys are the experts. You don't have to tell me about where you've committed fraud. The group was big enough. Someone had to your point, the same way where they go, I'm just going to report 50% this time. Or I'll close that one, in a week from now, and then that'll go through next year or whatever. Anyway. And so I asked that question. I was like, how do you see fraud committed in your sales process? And the overall kind of answer that stuck with me was the more incentives there are, which means the more complicated it is also. They said the easier it is to work, to work the system basically and take advantage of those. I thought that was really important. And I think you saw it with Wells Fargo, that incentive program of signing people up, and they went, cool, let me just go make up a bunch of accounts. Great. Give me my bonus now. So I've always thought about that. I know we have fraud people that listen to the show, ethics people also who listen to the show. And I just thought that was a really good takeaway from a sales, leader. That's their job, and they have a lot of experience there. So I get back to kind of topics at hand. I know you have, and you've mentioned your customer success background, maybe your marketing a little bit also, but I know you've also said a couple times that you're not a historical or traditional auditor. I forget how you put it. Clearly better than however I just put it, but classically trained. I think that's how you said it. Yeah, much better way of saying it. So how has that influenced you as an auditor, though? Do you take marketing principles or CS principles and apply those? What does that look like? And from those, what can the listeners take away and go, oh, that's good. Yeah, we should go do that.
A great question. And yes, so I had spent a fair number of years in the marketing space, marketing automation as well. And what that helped me learn was the value of telling good stories. And when you think about effective marketing, effective advertising, I'm going to use a big umbrella here when I say marketing and say that it covers everything from, those commercials that make us cry, even the television programs or movies that we watch that we feel really emotionally invested in a way that's all an element of marketing. And my personal belief is that audit, the risk of potentially denigrating the profession wholesale, we have a lot to learn in that area. And so I think, it's about the marketplace of ideas. It's about making sure that you are, and using the word selling makes it sound a little bit sort of garish, but you are selling your ideas and you're communicating those, because what I have found is we work on very short pieces of information, right? There have been many downstream effects that have been negative for us as human beings related to the social media boom, right? But one of the worst is that we tend to process information in very little increments of information. So that very small increments. And so that creates this problem where when as auditors, we have the responsibility often to deal with very complex situations. So you talked about fraud. The example that I provided, 9 times out of 10, a salesperson's going to say, I'm not committing fraud. I just wasn't sure that that was a deal that was going to be justifiably in my pipeline. And then it popped up. I don't think in their mind they're thinking about it that way. When you have a situation like that, it's very complex. There's often, human error or human interaction involved. And we as auditors have to communicate those concepts and boil them down. And I think as you were mentioning earlier, data governance. Data governance doesn't sound like a very sexy topic or even a topic most people want to invest in or have an interest in. Yet I would argue it is critically important to the lifeblood of almost every single company, whether you're a tech business or an old school manufacturing company. It is critically important for your long-term success. And so that the notion that you have to communicate something that could be very highly complex in a way that somebody who's really only giving you, these days, I never am able to get more than a 30-minute meeting unless it's something incredibly, urgent from leaders. They have 30 minutes, give it to me short, tell me the high level. You've got to tell those stories quickly. And that to me is where marketing comes in. When you think about traditional marketing, and I'm oversimplifying again, with all due respect to the marketing community, but you think of it as like a tip of the iceberg, right? What you see is the early message that you're giving. It's the top of that pyramid, if you will. It's the quick soundbite message. And then as you can get deeper, you can get more into those more detailed messages that people actually need to hear. And I think marketing skills are critical for that. How do you tell a story? How do you present? I mean, even everything from decks. What I encourage people to do is do not create the deck that is basically just you writing a document and copying and pasting the text into the deck. And we see that a lot. We still see that in presentations. And I encourage particularly auditors to think outside of that. Think in terms of putting a couple of sound bites and then explain a big concept. Use visuals. Learn how to, we have so many tools at our fingertips these days that can really help us communicate big ideas visually. And that's an area where ChatGPT and these generative AI tools can really help us to really showcase the message that we're trying to communicate. So I would argue that marketing is a critical skill also for auditors, because as we think about the future, we're going to have to change. We are already changing. You're seeing it in the new IAA standards. You're seeing this evolution. I would agree with you 100%. The idea of agile auditing wasn't really a thing probably 4 or 5 years ago. It's now everybody's talking about it. This idea of connected risk, which I think Richard Chambers is on the right track here and exactly where we need to be. The constant information that you're getting that's changing the risk profile. We're moving away from this like once a year risk assessment idea and more into there's constantly inputs that you're getting on your risk landscape, understanding those risks and then how you address them. But we still have the obligation, and I will say I'm going to kind of circle back to this AI, the comments we were making earlier. I worry a little bit with this chat GPT taking over and generative AI taking over a lot of things is many people are abdicating that process of thinking through these things. And we inevitably get lazy, and we could really, really create harm for our companies, for ourselves, for our careers by making these mistakes. And I'll point back to that lawyer who basically thought that ChatGPT was pulling correct data to understand what the legal cases his reputation, his career is probably ruined. And we have to be careful about that. And I think that's the marketing layover almost to the earlier conversation, is what marketers do really well is they think about what exactly are we trying to say? And then they figure out how to word that. And I think a lot of auditors can really benefit that. And then the value of telling a good story. Like that's what captures people's attention. I'm sure there are people going to be listening to this podcast who probably have put up a slide and know that everybody in the room that they're trying to talk to is completely disengaged.
Yeah.
And so how do you tell a story that actually pulls people in? And I think look, it's going to be incumbent for every single business person, like, to have that critical understanding and critical knowledge of how, just core marketing principles, so that you understand how to deliver a good message.
I appreciate that, especially because I feel like when I asked you that, it might have been like, go do a road show, or like, this is how you market internal audit. I didn't know where you're going to go with it. And so I do appreciate that, because it is, I think, pretty novel, but the way that you kind of summarize it at the end of marketers are really well at knowing the message and then how to communicate that or tell the story with it, I think is a really good way to summarize what your marketing perspective on that.
Yeah, and I'll actually add on to that too. Like, the roadshow is a great example. Like, go do a roadshow. Oh, well, we did that. It wasn't effective. And I can tell you, having marketing experience before and marketing consulting experience before, is I would say 9 times out of 10, when I was talking to a client in the marketing space and helping them build their marketing strategy, figure out how tactically they want to execute it, they would say, well, we've already done that. And the only way I could come back and convince them to continue in the path is say, well, let's look at how you did that and let's understand that. And so I think, and I see this in the webinars that I attend as a director in the internal audit space, people are hungry for that information in the audit space of saying, well, how do I do that? And just saying, well, go do a roadshow. I would argue, strip it down to the basics and say, how do you communicate your big ideas? How do you communicate your audit plan? How do you communicate what's important to you as an audit shop? And are you aligned with, because this is like the idea of having a customer, right? Marketing is always looking to make sure that they're aligned with what their customers need or want. Because the minute they're out of touch with that, they're not effective in what they're trying to do. And so that's another principle that I think internal audit, any folks in internal audit can really benefit from is, hey, we've got a message, but it's not just about the message. It's about, how is this message being received? And understanding, like, is our core audience, the people we care most about, are they actually responding to what we're saying? And if the answer is no, or the answer is I don't know, which is most often the
Yeah.
case, then that's where you really have work to do. And I think partnering with your own marketing team to understand, like, hey, when you do, depending on what kind of marketing, whatever your organization is involved in, but before you go out and do something, create a website, a landing page, an ad, whatever, what are you looking for? How do you think about that? And those principles directly apply to the internal auditor internally in terms of meeting and talking to stakeholders.
I don't know. Maybe it's just been like a theme or luck this year, because we've had a IT auditor, IT audit director go CAE. We've had a geographic information systems person become a CAE. We've had a tax person that we've talked to go CAE. So I think the marketing and CS background going to CAE has been really interesting. I'm starting to enjoy these, a lot. Again, back to that marketing perspective, I would not have expected that answer. And so I definitely learned something there. With that said, though, I'll throw it to you. The floor is yours. What do you want to leave the audience with today?
So I think, to me, what I'm seeing in the audit profession, and what I honestly would like to see more of, I'm seeing this pop up in places, but I definitely would like to see more of it, is, ultimately, we are here to provide assurance in the organizations that we operate in. But we also have, I believe, an obligation to do everything in our power to see that organization succeed. And I think Richard Chambers was talking about this in the podcast, that you have, that sort of conflict. And the thing I would like to leave with listeners or viewers of your podcast is, I do believe we are actually facing, without sounding too corny, a brave new world here. And technology is changing things for us so quickly that we as auditors have to keep pace with that change, but also with what our role is within the organization that we operate in. And I tend to love the phrase of, we shouldn't be in the business of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And, without being too grim about the loss of life on the Titanic, if we think in terms of, like, look, our job is to make sure that the deck chairs are all nice, neatly lined up, but there's something really critically going on within the company. There are times where we have to step up and we have to focus on that and help out and to drive what we need to do in order to make that company successful. And I think to me, the key to that is being comfortable with change, is almost thinking in terms of how do we invent yourself on a regular basis. And we talked about this throughout this conversation. And I think that's really critical for long-term audit, for success long-term in the internal audit space, is that I think the best of breeds, the top CAEs, the best performing teams, the ones where the CEO is going to say, I want you in the room during these conversations, are those that are going to understand those core ideas and be flexible about change and understand that change is just something you have to embrace and deal with. Because the minute you show that you're out of step, you get the okay boomer problem among the the younger generations, where they essentially dismiss you. And we don't want that as an internal audit job. We don't want that because I think the success of our markets is based on trust, and we have a very important role to play in that. And I think as we look ahead in the future, politics will change, governments will change. We have a responsibility to sort of keep pace and make sure that we're adding value to the organization. So that's the thing I would probably most want to leave with the people watching this podcast.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.